Hello and welcome to As the CMMC Churns. I'm Matt Titcomb from Peak InfoSec. Peak InfoSec is an authorized CMMC third-party assessment organization. I'm also a CMMC certified assessor and CMMC curriculum developer. Today's episode of As the CMMC Churns is vulnerability management for remote workers. And as always, this is never scripted after this point, so what happens is what happens. Now, remote management took a big shift for remote workers with COVID. Everybody being forced to work from home, especially for people that were not on production floors, etc., forced massive shifts to the way we all operate as a business. Interesting study coming out of the National Bureau of Economic Development basically showed that people that had the ability to work from home after the pandemic still want to. Kind of seeing a swing back to some degree. So we expect many businesses are going to look to want to have employees back in the office to some degree based on the business during the week. And for some businesses, we had one client literally, DOD ordered them and told them they were not authorized to work from home on specific contracts. You can kind of read between the lines as to what contracts we'd be talking about, but they do occur. So this remote management created a lot of problems. We had to figure a lot of stuff out. And a lot of that was knowledge that we all figured out back then, but it made sense to kind of bring it back up as things continue to shift and change. Now, when it comes to vulnerability management, we kind of also need to understand what vulnerability management is. And it's going to come down to that vulnerability management lifecycle. And it always starts with identify assets, which is going to come from 311. And this is primarily to identify and limit access to authorized devices. You have to know what devices are accessing CUI, first and foremost. And then all the protection assets. So don't forget those too. Now, related to that is once you've identified them, you now need to know the vulnerabilities. Here comes the catch. Many times in 800.171, when we start talking life cycles, things like that, NIST, when they created the requirements and the related assessment objectives, they were not necessarily grouped around a life cycle. They span the families. And we can see this one here. It starts in the risk assessment and actually impacts the security integrity family. Now, when it comes to patching, the remediation of vulnerabilities, that's the next step, is we see the same thing happening here. Well, it goes up to maintenance, to again, back into risk assessment, and then security integrity. One is, are you identifying? One of them, are you actually doing it? You know, it's kind of that the dualism of 800.171 at the assessment objective level. And this is the way sometimes it plays out. Now, when we look at this, we also need to recognize in context what we mean by vulnerability scanning for that second stage of the life cycle. For this, we're going to jump actually to 171 alpha, the assessment objectives. And in here, we're primarily going to look at the two words here. You're scanning applications and you're scanning systems. Applications in the context of the discussion are primarily going to be static code that you have access to the code. They're talking static and dynamic code analysis. This is normally custom code project that you're doing on yourselves internally. For many businesses, this doesn't apply. And like us at Peak InfoSec, it didn't apply. So when we wrote up our SSP and we gave it to DIBCAC for assessment objective C and D, we wrote the answer down as non-applicable. And we explained because we only use COTS. We don't do any custom development. We will one day have as the CMMC churns on, well, how do you handle custom development and what is a secure software development lifecycle plan and yeah, all that. It's kind of a fun one. That's kind of a very niche area that we're kind of putting off until we kind of get down to somebody that really has a driving need for that one. As far as for the context, what we're going to talk about from here on in, we're talking COTS products, the system part. It's your operating system, it's the installed software, it's the firmware, and configurations. So those four parts are what we're primarily going to be talking about here. Now, when it came to remote workers and vulnerability management, we obviously hit the first thing. Now they're working at home, they want to bring their own device. Aside from mobile, cell phones, and tablets where you can kind of do a better job locking it down and they can create isolated memory spaces, do not allow personal computers. Yeah, you're just going to bring in a huge problem with that space, so don't do it. But then it also comes down to keeping those remote company-owned devices and even some of those BYOD tablets, etc., in compliance. Now, the way to handle that fundamentally is going to be a mobile device management software package. It's kind of the way it's handled today. A lot of them out there, but we're kind of got to deal with the compliant environments, and that limits to what's available for you in some way. Then the other problem that came up is everybody working from home. You have the classic scanning engine running on your network. They're not necessarily using a VPN, so you never know their vulnerabilities. Thankfully, agent-based scanning is now the default. Tenable was one of the last ones to catch on to doing this. But you want to install an agent that scans the endpoint automatically. There's no scanning job. It's just done in the background as a scheduled service. And then the other problem that came up was remote patching. Suddenly, they're no longer on your local network. They're not in the office. They're not connecting to your SCCM server or other patching software. So now you basically needed to go to some type of remote maintenance and monitoring type tool to handle this. A lot of them came out. They were already out there, but they definitely picked up a lot of growth as a result of this during COVID. Now, when it comes down to it, let's kind of keep these issues in mind, and let's go back to the life cycle and walk through how we handle this in the life cycle. Now, first and foremost, we're primarily going to be talking laptops and mobile devices. Most people did not bring their PCs, workstations home, or definitely servers. It did happen for a couple, and then once we started having conversations about some of the stuff they were now doing, because you basically now cannot say if you've got a server at home, that is no longer an alternate location, so things kind of got ugly quick. Came back to an office. When it comes down to it, you are looking for that endpoint management solution. Typically, by default, we are going with, on this one, for identifying assets between Microsoft Endpoint Manager, also known as Intune, which is now going to get rebranded as Intune, also known as Microsoft Endpoint Manager, rebranded now as Intune Premium. Gotta love Microsoft for their confusion. And Defender for Endpoint, which is also now Defender 365, Security 365. Hey, hint, hint, if anybody from Microsoft is working out in listing this, please have a conversation with your marketing team to stop changing names. I should have just stuck with Intune, but sorry, rabbit hole. Again, unscripted. When you're using products like this, you can definitely meet all of the related assessment objectives to identify your assets and limit access. Other things you got to do for the limiting part, but again, you can fulfill these. When it comes to identifying vulnerabilities, again, we love Defender for Endpoint. It works on Linux, Macs, tablets, you name it, it works. Other ones that you can identify vulnerabilities are Qualys, Rapid7, and Tenable. They're all agent-based. And when you do all of these, they all, again, will meet the assessment objectives that you've got. The one thing specifically to 3.11.2 Alpha, their very first assessment objective, when you're using agent-based scanning, you need to specify in however you're documenting this, is that we will use agent-based scanning and the vendor is responsible for the time between when that agent scans. Now, the good news is when you actually come down to 3.11.2 Delta, vulnerability scans are performed on organizational systems when new vulnerabilities are identified. I love Defender for Endpoint. Here's why. I get Defender for Endpoint notices of vulnerabilities and affected endpoints faster than I get notices from CISA. Yep, sometimes a day and a half ahead of when I actually finally get the CISA notice. When it comes down to it, and this came up with DipGAC, it literally came in, oh look, here's a new one, and then the day later CISA notice came in. We were actually in ahead of schedule for when we were supposed to be reporting per our policy, so You want those type of solutions that help you to keep on your toes. Now, when it comes to patching, this is the hard problem. Now, by default, let's talk software patching. All the products up there except for Endpoint Manager will do software patching today. Intune Premium, what you see in the star, is a capability coming out from Microsoft that is basically enhancing autopilot, which is available commercial, not on GCC, that will allow patching. Windows centric, but again, all of these tools will allow you to do the patching, Microsoft in a future to be state, and configuration management of those devices. So again, you're kind of looking at these different types of products and capabilities to make sure your systems are being both patched for the operating system, firmware, applications, and configurations locked down. They can do it, but again, you've got to set up the processes, procedures. There's no silver bullet here with just grabbing one of these. Now, when it comes down to it, what you're noticing is there's different options out there. One of the things is when you start looking at these different types of options, especially for patching, there's different pros and cons and strengths for all of them. Now, what we give here is kind of a generic chart that kind of gives you a high-level overview. This is a nice starting point from a requirements mapping to see where things work. Whether or not, as you can see, the products that support Android, great news is on that one. When you install the company portal on Android and you let it tie to Defender for Endpoint, you now know everything that's going on with that Android. Best way to handle them. Apple products, again, almost all of them support Apple, so commonly Linux is then the next most limited. Now, what you'll see on Linux is almost all of them support Linux except for jamf. Let's briefly talk about jamf. If you're a heavy Mac environment and you've got a lot of Mac devices, you want to use jamf. It is Mac-centric. It really doesn't support Windows. If you want to support Windows, you want to use Defender or an Endpoint Manager. Now, the beauty of jamf is it integrates with Endpoint Manager and Defender for Endpoint on GCC High. So it will help you to fulfill all of your configuration access policies while doing complete integration of your Mac environment into both Azure Active Directory for users and devices and configurations and protection. Great solution. If you're a Mac user, that's what you really want to use in large. Now, Linux is then another problem, but again, you're kind of have to pick on the different products. Now, Defender for Endpoint works great in tracking Linux and finding configurations, but Microsoft Endpoint Manager does not support Linux yet in GCC High. It's just starting to pop up on commercial and will be coming out to GCC High maybe later this year, maybe next year. The real thing you're looking for here is, again, agent-based scanning. All the products are going to do this. Again, you now see the difference kind of in where Defender for Endpoint and Endpoint Manager as a combo meet all of your requirements there. You want to be able to fix your configurations and you want to do patching. Now, for us as Peak InfoSec, if you're a hybrid environment, Mac, Windows, Linux, you're running in Endpoint Manager using Defender for Endpoint, we typically steer you towards Automox. It works really well. We've used it with our commercial clients in Silicon Valley, and we've had rave reviews. They all have problems. There's no perfect patching, but so far that one's been the best we've had. After that, in a true hybrid environment, Qualys also does pretty well. So those are some of the tools out there that you could look for to use to support you. Again, if you're in a pure Mac environment, jamf does a great job on Macs. But once you kind of get outside of a Mac only, kind of need something else. Now, let's sum up. Vulnerability management is really made of three main steps of tracking your assets, knowing your vulnerabilities, and then fixing them. And vulnerability management lifecycle touches a lot of the different domains in CMMC and 800.171. Tools do exist, but you notice I didn't tell you really what to do. It really does depend upon your portfolio and what best fits for your business. And this is a hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, patch, patch, patch as fast as you can. I know it's not the primary topic of this, but it is the best way to protect yourself from nation states, hackers, etc. When you're not patching or you're not securely configuring your devices, you've left your house open in a high crime neighborhood. And unfortunately, if you're connected to the internet, you are in a high crime neighborhood. Doesn't matter. So just kind of accept the fact that you need to keep patched and you need to stay secure, and you really want to use your vulnerability management solution to protect you. Next week on As the CMMC Churns, we're going to talk about over-engineering for CMMC. Yeah, there's a lot of this going on, and there's a lot of confusion going on about how people are overcomplicating things. So we're going to try and help you out with that one and simplify how you're doing your technical approaches to CMMC. Again, I'm Matt Titcomb from Peak InfoSec. Thanks for joining us for As the CMMC Churns, and we'll see you next time.